31 AWS services have been discontinued or quietly sunsetted since 2020. WorkMail and App Runner just joined that list, and if either one is in your infrastructure, you have a hard deadline problem, not a roadmap concern. Let's start with WorkMail because that one is straightforward. AWS is killing it. Full stop. No maintenance mode, no graceful fade, end of life. WorkMail was AWS's managed email and calendar service, essentially a hosted exchange alternative that lived inside your AWS account and played nicely with IAM and your existing VPC setup. It never had a huge footprint. Most enterprises that needed managed email went to Google Workspace or Microsoft 365, and WorkMail always felt like the option you chose only if you had a compliance reason to keep email inside AWS, or if you were already deep enough in the AWS ecosystem that adding one more managed service felt like zero friction. AWS hasn't published the exact EOL date prominently in the press coverage, so if you're running WorkMail, go check the official deprecation notice directly. Do not rely on secondhand reporting for your migration deadline. What is clear is that new customer signups are already blocked, and existing customers are on a countdown. Your migration path is either Microsoft 365, Google Workspace, or if you genuinely need email inside your own infrastructure, something self-hosted like Postfix with Dovecot, or a managed alternative like Fastmail for Business or Proton Business. None of those are drop-in replacements from an API or IAM integration standpoint, so budget time for your identity team. App Runner is a different and more operationally interesting story. AWS is not killing it outright. They're moving it to what they're calling maintenance mode, and they've stopped accepting new customers. Maintenance mode at AWS means existing workloads keep running, you get security patches, but you get no new features, no new regions, and no investment. The service is being kept alive because killing it immediately would be a breach of trust with existing customers. But the message is clear. App Runner is not where AWS is putting engineering resources. For context on what App Runner actually was, it launched in 2021 as a fully managed container service aimed squarely at developers who didn't want to think about clusters, load balancers, or auto-scaling configuration. You hand it a container image or a source code repository, it builds and runs it, handles HTTPS, scales to 0, the whole pitch. The problem was positioning. App Runner sat in an awkward middle ground between Lambda, which handles event-driven workloads with sub-second billing granularity, and ECS Fargate, which gives you more control and integrates with the rest of the AWS container ecosystem. App Runner was never as cheap as Lambda for bursty workloads, and it was never as flexible as Fargate for anything serious. It found a niche with teams that wanted Heroku-style simplicity inside AWS, but that niche was small enough that AWS clearly decided the maintenance cost wasn't worth it. If you're on App Runner today, here's the operational reality. Your workloads will continue to run. Security patches will come, but you should treat this the same way you treat any dependency that's been flagged for end of support. Start your migration planning now, not when AWS announces an actual sunset date, because that date will come and the runway will feel shorter than it does today. Your most natural migration target is ECS Fargate with an application load balancer, which gives you the same containerized deployment model with significantly more surface area for configuration and a much longer AWS investment horizon. If you were using App Runner specifically because you wanted minimal ops overhead, you should also evaluate whether something like Railway, Render, or Fly EO actually fits your needs better than staying inside AWS at all. Those are legitimate options, especially for smaller teams where the AWS ecosystem integration isn't a hard requirement. Now zoom out, because the WorkMail and App Runner announcements are not isolated. They're part of a pattern that's worth naming explicitly. AWS has been quietly pruning its service catalog for several years. SimpleDB gone, Amazon Chime SDK's standalone service being wound down, AWS Ops Works, end of life in 2024. Code Commit stopped accepting new customers in 2024. The common thread is low adoption relative to maintenance cost, and the secondary thread is services that competed with better established third-party tools that most engineers were already using anyway. AWS built a lot of these services in the 2015 to 2020 era when the strategy was to have a managed AWS version of everything. That strategy has clearly shifted. The current AWS posture is to win on compute, storage, networking, and AI infrastructure, and to let the application layer tooling be handled by the ecosystem. What that means for your team is a real architectural consideration. If you have a service in your stack that is not a core AWS primitive, not EC2, not S3, not RDS, not Lambda, not the core networking stack, you should be periodically checking its adoption signal. Low adoption managed services at AWS are now demonstrated EOL risks. That's not FUD, that's a pattern with enough data points to treat as policy. There's also a budget angle here that doesn't get talked about enough. When AWS sunsets a service, your migration isn't free. You're paying engineering time. You're potentially paying for more expensive replacement service during a transition period, and you're paying for the risk of a rushed migration if you don't start early enough. WorkMail customers who've been running it for compliance reasons are now facing the cost of rebuilding their email compliance posture on a new platform, and that is not a weekend project. The operational cost of a vendor sunset is almost always underestimated because it gets categorized as a one-time project rather than a real infrastructure cost. One thing that's unclear from the reporting is whether AWS is offering any migration credits or tooling to help WorkMail customers move their data. AWS has done this inconsistently with past sunsets. Sometimes there's a data export tool, sometimes there's a migration guide, sometimes there's nothing useful. Check the official AWS deprecation documentation, and if your usage is significant enough, open a support ticket and ask directly what migration assistance is available. Don't assume the blog post covers everything. The practical takeaway is this: audit your AWS bill this week specifically for services outside the core compute and storage primitives. For anything on that list, check whether AWS has published any maintenance mode or EOL language in the last 12 months. If you're on WorkMail, get your migration timeline in writing before the end of this quarter. If you're on App Runner, start your Fargate migration design now so you're not doing it under pressure. And going forward, treat low adoption managed services from any major cloud provider the way you treat a dependency with a single maintainer on GitHub useful, but carrying a risk you need to consciously accept.